Hello again, everyone. So I got a new week, new teams, and I'll be talking about Toronto sports teams this week. Going back home to Canada. My parents are visiting from Canada. They're over here in the UK right now. We'll be arriving tomorrow. So I'm going to be talking about the Raptors today of the NBA, and then I'm going to get my dad on with me when I'm talking about the Leafs and the Blue Jays. So, like I said today, I'm going to talk about the Raptors. For those regular viewers, you're probably used to seeing me in a red hat, but I got on the Blue Jays hat this week. Wanted to don the Blue Jays hat while I'm talking about Toronto sports teams, and I'm going to start off, like I said, with the Raptors of the NBA. Last year, they won the Atlantic Division with a 49-33 record, although, to be fair, in my opinion, it's the weakest division in the whole NBA. The East is obviously a very weak conference compared to the West. Bad grammar there. My wife, who is a teacher, is going to probably scold me for that one. But the Atlantic Division is very weak. So, as much as the AL East in baseball is the toughest division, which the Blue Jays play in there, the Atlantic Division that the Raptors play in is a very, very weak division. Their 49-33 record is very, very impressive, but a record like that should be winning you that division with ease. And I think that's definitely something that they can get to again this upcoming season, but they got to find a way to get deeper into the playoffs. And that's why I think they're going to have a lot different look to them. And I think they've definitely added in pieces and let go of a few pieces that I think does make this team better. Just look at some other teams in the division before I talk about their current roster and some guys that have left. In my opinion, the only team that might compete with them for the Atlantic Division title is going to be the Boston Celtics. I do think it'll come down between those two teams. The Celtics last year were 40-42, made the playoffs. The Brooklyn Nets were 38-44 and also made the playoffs. The 76ers and the Knicks are the other two teams in that division. They didn't even have 20-win seasons last year, so they're definitely not going to be competing in this division for a while. So, like I said, I think it's going to come down between the Raptors and the Celtics. Maybe the Nets are a dark horse and find a way to win this division, but I definitely think it is still the Raptors' division to lose. Looking at guys who left and signed elsewhere, or guys that just did not re-sign. Biggest name, obviously, Amir Johnson. He went and signed with the Celtics, so stays in the division. Obviously, that's gonna be intense when these teams meet. But for me, not a huge loss. He did play in 75 games last year for the team, so that's obviously important that you get a guy who can play consistently. But he has had injury problems. His production isn't exactly where I would want it to be. He just averaged 9.3 points and 6 boards a game last year. So, in my opinion, those aren't starting numbers. He's a solid bench guy, I think. He's probably going to start in Boston, and maybe a change of pace, a change of scenery will help him rejuvenate his career, but not too upset about losing Amir Johnson. Grievous Vasquez is the first guard I'll talk about. Obviously, they traded him away for, I think, a pick in 2017. I think a first-round pick in 2017. So maybe that'll turn into a great player down the road. We'll see what happens. Solid bench guard for sure. Last year, averaged 9.5 points with 2.5 boards and about 3.5 assists per game. So a solid guy to have as a bench option. And then the other guard off the bench, obviously, sixth man of the year. Lou Williams went inside with the Lakers, played in 80 games last year for this team. Averaged 15.5 points with a couple boards and a couple assists. When you look at guys who win the Sixth Man of the Year award, I'll bring up James Harden, obviously. He wins the Sixth Man of the Year for the Thunder, goes and leaves to become the guy in Houston, and is having a lot of success there. And I don't think the Thunder have been the same team since James Harden left. I don't think Lou Williams is that kind of a sixth man that he's going to go to LA and become a star in LA and become the guy in LA. No, I don't think that at all. I think he's going to be a solid bench guy, a good veteran guy for the young players that they have there to learn from, for sure. But I don't think he's going to jump into a starting role with the Lakers. I still think he is, going to be able to maybe average 10, 12 points a night. But we'll see what happens. But those are the three guys they lost. But guys they brought in, and this is where I think the upgrade happens. DeMarre Carroll, brought him in, coming from the Atlanta Hawks. Obviously, the number one team in the East last year. Winning mentality, winning organization, coming from there, coming to Toronto. It's important, I think, with a young team and a team that wants to see continued success, that guys you bring in come from teams that have success or have a good veteran presence. And I think DeMarre Carroll does that for this team. Last year, he averaged 12.5 points per game with 5.5 boards and about 1.5 assists. Great forward to bring into this team for sure. Corey Joseph, Canadian on the team now, which I know the nationality of a player really doesn't matter. If they got talent, they got talent. If they don't, they don't. But Ujiri, the GM of the Raptors, has stated in the past he wants to bring Canadian players to Toronto, and if they have the talent, then it's just a nice thing that the fans are going to appreciate. They're probably going to play harder for the Raptors being the only team in Canada and that they are Canadian. They're going to put in that little bit of extra effort that maybe they wouldn't necessarily put in on other NBA teams. And I think Corey Joseph, not that he didn't put the effort in San Antonio, but I think he's now going to be a big fan favorite since he is Canadian, and he's going to put in that work and be a solid guard option for this team. He's also only 24 years old, so he's still young. He turns 24 on August 20th, I should say. And with the Spurs last year, he averaged about 7 points per game with 2.5 boards and 2.5 assists. So he might see some more playing time with the Raptors than he did in San Antonio. Obviously, he's been playing behind Tony Parker, which is a great veteran guy to learn from. I think any young guard in this league, if they had an opportunity to learn from Tony Parker, is going to grab that opportunity and run with it. So I think that's important. And again, winning organization, San Antonio, bringing him in. Another guy that brought in Bismack Biyombo, not necessarily a guy that's come from winning organizations or anything like that, but he's also only 23, turns 23 at the end of the month, I should say, August 28th. So again, Joseph and Biyombo, these two guys are very young, both under 25. Biyombo was the 7th overall pick just back in 2011, and last year he averaged 5 points per game with 6.5 boards. So, a solid guy that, if he develops and grows and matures, could be, an 8+ rebound a night kind of a guy. I don't want to quite say double-digit boards per night, but I think 8+ is definitely not something that's out of the realm of being a possibility for him. Last guy, Louis Scola, they brought him in. Great veteran guy. I think he's highly underrated. Last year he averaged about 10 points a game with 6.5 boards, and I just think he's a very underrated player and a solid bench guy. When I look at the starting lineup, I think of those 4 guys, Damari Carroll's in the starting lineup. He's the one forward. The other forward in the starting lineup for me is Terrence Ross. He's only 24 years old. He flip-flopped from being a starter to being on the bench to being a starter to being on the bench, and that can be a hard thing for a young guy to do. But he ran with it. He adapted to those changing scenarios well, at least in my opinion, as well as he could. But I think he's only 24. You got to start this kid and just roll with it, And after the first 5 games he hasn't produced, that doesn't mean he now goes to the bench. You got to let him play the first 15, 20 games, and then see how he does. You don't just we've played 5 games and he's only averaging 4 points a night. We got to put him to the bench and bring in Patterson as a starter or James Johnson as a starter. No, you gotta run with this kid and see what can happen with him for sure. 2 starting guards, obviously Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan. DeRozan is only 26 years old, averaged 20 points per game last year with 4.5 boards and 3.5 assists. Hopefully he does stay with the team. I know some reports I've read is Toronto doesn't want to pay him. If I'm Toronto, I find a way to pay this guy. I think he deserves a max contract. I think he's the all-star on this team. I think he's the face of this franchise. And again, he's also only 26, so if you can find a way to keep this guy for another 4 or 5 years, you do that, and you build around this guy. You keep him and Lowry, you bring in Damari Carroll, you have Corey Joseph now, Ross is only 24, you got a good, young, solid team here that's going to grow and continue to do good things, so I find a way to pay this guy. You got a guy that averages 20 points per game, he deserves a max contract. That's my thoughts with DeMar DeRozan. Kyle Lowry, last year averaged about 18 points per game with 4.5 boards, about 7 assists. Solid guard options right there. DeRozan only played in 60 games, Lowry in 70. So again, if these guys can play a full season together, I think that would definitely help the Raptors. Again, 49-33 record last year. If those guys are healthy, I think a 50-win season is definitely possible for this team. But they got to find a way to get deeper in the playoffs, and I think just having all of that come together is going to help. And again, with these new acquisitions, they're going to need time to build chemistry. So if they start the season 2-8 and Toronto fans are now worried, what's going to happen? Don't get worried. These guys are going to need time to build chemistry, and they'll find a way to win. These guys have talent, and it's just going to take them a little bit of time, even with preseason and all that stuff, to find their mesh and how to mesh with one another. But that'll happen. Lastly, the starting 5. Like I said, I think you got Damari Carroll and Ross at the forward positions, Lowry and DeRozan at the guard positions. Who's your center? Valanciunas. And this is my one sour spot with the Raptors. I'm not a huge fan of Valanciunas. I think he's a solid center. I'm just not a huge fan of him. He's also only 23, so he's still young and he could still grow and develop for sure. Last year he averaged 12 points per game with 8.5 boards, so he could grow into a double-digit board guy, no problem. That's definitely not out of the ordinary or something that could not happen with him. For me, he just doesn't strike fear into my eyes. I could be Nate Robinson at 5'7", and I'd have no problem driving the lane on Valanciunas, and he's a 7-footer. He just doesn't have the intimidation factor that I think a 7-footer should have. And again, he's also only 23. He's still gonna need time to grow and learn, and he's a good player for this team. I'm just not as excited about him as I am with Lowry and DeRozan. But again, still a good solid player for this team. Looking at the bench, like I said, I think Biyombo, Joseph, and Scola are your bench guys, with James Johnson and Patterson rounding that out. Caboclo is, we'll see what happens with his development. He's only 20, and Ugira, another center they have on the team, he's only 23. But with Johnson and Patterson, looking at their numbers last year, they both averaged about 8 points per game. Johnson had about 3.5 boards, Patterson about 5.5 boards, and they each had about an assist and a half kind of per game. So solid guys to have coming off the bench, as will Scola be, and Joseph and Biyombo. I think those are solid guys to have coming off the bench. So if I look at the 10 guys, you got Carroll and Ross starting forwards, DeRozan and Lowry guard positions, Valanciunas starts at the center position. Then you got Biyombo, Joseph, Scola, James Johnson, and Patterson coming off the bench. And then maybe Nugira and Caboclo, and we'll see what happens if they get into some games. Or maybe they'll play in the D-League now that we have a D-League team in Toronto as well. But those are my thoughts on the Raptors. I'm not going to get too much. I would have talked about the draft picks. Obviously, DeLon Wright, point guard, maybe he'll get some playing time as well with this team. But I think the D-League team for him, that's in Toronto, would be a good spot for him to go. As well as Norman Powell, who's a shooting guard that was drafted 46th overall that they picked up in a trade. I think those two guys would be good to go down to the D-League, as with Caboclo and Nugira, and then see what happens with those guys. But maybe DeLon Wright will get some playing time behind Lowry and Corey Joseph and DeRozan at that guard position, but we'll see what happens. Overall, though, those are my thoughts on the Raptors. Hopefully you enjoyed them. If you don't, that's okay too. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can do so at GHAM614. And I'll be back again later this week with my thoughts on the Blue Jays of the MLB as well as the Maple Leafs of the NHL. Thank you again all for watching and listening. I do appreciate the support. And that's it for now. Bye-bye.